After understanding the nature of the average and the marginal cost curves in the short run and the long run, now we are going to determine the output level where the maximization of the profit happens. Primarily we shall have a quantitative look at it, and then we will go towards the diagrams of the two possible cases, that is the perfect competition and the monopoly. So the output determination in a firm is the most desirable when the profit is maximized. Output should be at that level where the profit is maximized, which is the difference of revenue and the cost. Now if we take the derivative of this function with respect to Q, that is the output, because revenue depends upon output, so does cost. So the level of profit also should depend automatically on the level of output. Now we take the derivative with respect to Q on both sides. This is how it will look like. Since we do not have any exact form of it or any numerical form, so we just write them in the derivative general notation. For the maximization, we find out the first order conditions primarily, which require it to be equal to 0. So this is why instead of this we can write 0. So we have written 0 instead of d pi over dq. Now we can rearrange it after using the more economic term, that is derivative of revenue function with respect to output is the marginal revenue, derivative of the cost function with respect to output is the marginal cost function. Now we take the difference as the minus sign is still there. Now we rearrange them in the next step, which becomes MR is equal to MC, which is the necessary condition for profit maximization. But there is another condition, which is the sufficient condition, that we will develop in the second order condition. In the second order condition for maximization, we take the second order derivative, so it becomes second order derivative once we differentiate it one more time with respect to Q. So d over dq gets introduced on both of the sides, and this should be less than 0 for maximization. This is what we have understood in the optimization process. Now the derivative term gets distributed on both of these terms, that is dr over dq and dc over dq. So minus sign, it is kept as it is, and we can consider this derivative as the slope and this derivative as the marginal revenue, because it is marginal revenue. We have already understood it from here. This can be considered as the marginal cost, so here we can write marginal cost. So d over dq is here, slope is there. So this is the slope of marginal revenue, this is the slope of marginal cost. So we are writing these terms, that is slope of marginal revenue, slope of marginal cost, and the less than 0 sign is retained. This term becomes positive when we shift it to the other side, and now the inequality suggests that the slope of MR should be less than the slope of MC. In other words, the marginal cost curve that has a greater slope should cut the marginal revenue curve from below. This will happen naturally, as you will see that MC will cut MR from below. This is the case of the perfect competition, and the conditions that we have understood before are applied here. We are using all of the cost variants that we used, marginal cost, average cost, and all those variants that we studied in the short run. And we have a marginal revenue curve, which is a horizontal line, because in perfect competition the price is given and is determined by the market forces and is not influenced by the sellers or the buyers. So this is the price and marginal revenue curve. This also shows the demand in case of the perfect competition. This is the short run marginal cost curve, this is the short run average cost curve, and this is the short run average variable cost. The intersection of marginal cost curve, that is this, and MR curve, that is this horizontal line, happens at point C. So this is the initial condition or the necessary condition for profit maximization. This leads us to the value of Q, which is Q status, and it intersects the average total cost curve here at point T, and this gives us this level of the average cost This is the level of average cost, this is the level of price as mentioned here. So price is greater than the average cost curve, so this gives us the profit per unit, but we have sold more than one unit, that is Q status, so we have to sum up all these per unit profits from the units of output. So the total area would be this shaded area shows the total profit. So the condition is used here, that is the first condition, MC is equal to MR, and the other condition is visible here when we see that MC, which is this curve, is cutting MR, which is this straight line, from below. So MC cuts MR from below. It is visible here. So the second condition, or the sufficient condition, is also proved that we just developed mathematically above. So this is how it happens. We must not overlook this maximum quantity in the short run. It is a cap on the production that can happen in the short run. So the perfect competition is understood. Now we can consider the monopoly, and in case of monopoly, the marginal revenue curve and the demand curve, that is the average revenue curve, is slightly different from what we have seen in the perfect competition. This is something we have studied in the basics of microeconomics. Here it is being repeated, but with a little bit of evidence of why marginal revenue curve is like this. Marginal revenue curve is a downward sloping diagram. We can do this simply by making a table in which we can take the revenue, total revenue, and then we can take its marginal revenue values, and then we can plot them for a certain monopoly case. For the simplicity, we consider that the demand curve is linear, though it's not necessarily a linear function, but we assume that it is a linear curve. So if the demand curve is this is actually the inverse demand curve, where price is a function of output. Then A1 and A0 and A1, they are considered to be positive values. If they are positive values, then the relationship is retained, the relationship will remain negative, which means that the law of demand will hold. The total revenue can be found by this, that is, the total revenue is a function, is a product of price and output. So this is the output, this is the value of price, and this is the output, and we solve them. We get this function, which is a quadratic function, which is the revenue function, which is the product of price and output. Total revenue is calculated because we were interested in finding out the marginal revenue. The marginal revenue is the derivative of the total revenue. We found this derivative, and the negative sign in this marginal revenue function shows that there is a negative slope of the marginal revenue function, which is visible here, and the average revenue function is a little above than that. We can again make these curves by considering a revenue function and by calculating the marginal revenue function in that table and average revenue series in that table by considering various values of Q starting from 0 and then up to any level. So the condition that we developed will be used here as well, that is marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue. So this is the marginal cost curve. It is here meeting the marginal revenue curve. So this is that point where they meet. So we should consider this as the starting point. This is the equilibrium output, and the next condition that we should use, which is the sufficient condition for profit maximization, is that MC cuts MR from below. And this is happening here because this is the MC curve, and you can see it is cutting MR from below, and this is the MR curve. So that other condition is also getting verified. So we can go towards the average revenue curve, and then we can come to the price axis. This gives us certain price that we can charge, and from the average total cost curve we will get the average cost at equilibrium, which is this. So you see that the price level is far greater than the average cost curve. So profit per unit is substantial as it is monopoly. If you look at the perfect competition, it was quite small as compared to this one. So the monopoly per unit profit is quite substantial, and we are selling Q status units of the output. So we accumulate them and that can be done simply by calculating the area of this rectangle, which is the length into width, and then we will have the total profit, which will be the maximized value of the profit, as both of the conditions that we understood are satisfied. This was the case of monopoly, this was the case of perfect competition, and this was the condition that we developed primarily, and then we applied it to find out the output level where the profit is maximized both in perfect competition as well as in monopoly. Thank you.